Welcome to the Reconnected Human Podcast. This is our interview with Tom Campbell. If you would like to check out more of our stuff, go to reconnectedhuman.com. You can find us on Facebook and iTunes and stuff like that. And come by and enjoy some of the other interviews we've had with some other really beautiful minds. Thank you guys so much for listening. Welcome, everybody, to the Reconnected Human Podcast. We're super delighted to have Mr. Tom Campbell on today. Tom, thank you very much for coming on the show, man. We really, really appreciate it.
You're very welcome, Justin. It's my pleasure to be here.
Tom, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us kind of what you're doing right now and a little bit of a background on how you got to where you are right now.
Okay. I am by education and profession a physicist and have been now for a long time. I've got probably close to 40 years of experience in that field. And around the same time, I shouldn't say that around the same time, but within several months of getting out of graduate school and finding my first job, I also had an introduction to Bob Monroe. He lived not that far from where I lived. So, I went to visit him with a bunch of other people. He was working, maybe I should say who Bob Monroe is. Bob Monroe wrote a book called Journeys Out of Body. The time I met him, that was the only book. Since that time, he has written two more, and that was Far Journeys and Ultimate Journey were the last two books. Mm-hmm. Now, Bob Monroe is dead. He's no longer with us, but I'm talking now in about the 1970s, early 70s, 1972 or so. So it's a long time back. So that's about when I got out of graduate school and started working for a living, other than, teaching at the university. And, that's also about the time I started studying altered states and larger consciousness system and doing consciousness research. So my physics career and my metaphysics career both got launched at about the same time. So I've got about 40 years in both.
How would you describe yourself during that time when you were doing mostly physics? Were you more of kind of a straight line, straight arrow kind of guy, or?
Yeah, absolutely. I was like most young physicists. My idea, it's not true right up until that time, but until I first tried meditation, which was a thing that was passing around in the early 1970s, around colleges particularly. Transcendental meditation, expensive to people who weren't college students, but college students, got it at real cheap price. Mm-hmm. And it said that you, wouldn't have to sleep so much and it was healthy and so on. So, I thought, well, that sounds good. And I did that, and that let me know that there was more to reality than what I had thought. Now, as a physicist, what I thought was like most scientists think, and that is that I defined reality with what's called operational definition. That means if you can operate on it, if you can measure it, okay? If you can measure it, if you can perform some sort of operations with it, it's real. Mm-hmm. If you can't measure it, it's either not real or it's irrelevant. Only things that you can measure and quantify are parts of the real world or of the significant world. Okay, that's a typical kind of scientific attitude toward reality. And that was my attitude toward reality then. Then I learned how to meditate. And then I discovered in a meditation state, I could debug software 100 times more effectively than I could in an awake state. Mm. And that was a big aha moment for me. Back in those days, you had boxes of cards. It wasn't like debugging software today on a terminal. You had, 7 boxes of cards with 900 cards in each box with little punch holes in the cards. And something didn't work right. And the computer only told you something didn't work right. And you had, 3,000 cards to find out what didn't work right, and it might not have been a bad statement or a missed comma at all. It may have been that one of the little holes in the punch card wasn't exactly centered properly, you see. It's really hard to debug. So in those days, you spent 3 or 4 weeks debugging and, a half an hour running on the computer. That sort of thing. Of course, mainframes in those days weren't even as good as laptops are now, so it was a different world at that time. So this debugging was more important in a longer phase than it was before. Besides, you'd put your run in to run on the computer and it might take 3 or 4 days before it would come back. You didn't get the instantaneous runs that you get now. Mm-hmm. So what I used to do in 2 or 3 weeks worth of debugging, I now could do in minutes in a meditation state. I could just bring up my software, my listings, my card deck, if you will, and let my mind sort through it, and the ones that had errors on it would pop out at me. I could look at it, I could look at the line, I could read it, I could say, it's card number, 857, there's the problem there, and then I could go pull that card, look at it, find the error, and fix it. And I was astounded by my ability to be able to do that with consciousness, and it was accurate, So that was like the first big aha moment that a physicist, I was still in graduate school, and almost physicist, was, that my reality was more than what I could measure. I mean, I really couldn't measure this thing. I got the results. I could see what the results were, but the thing itself, what was the function? What was going on? How did I get that information? That was all unmeasurable. There wasn't any way to get a handle on it. Obviously, it was outside of this reality, and obviously, it wasn't irrelevant.
Right.
It worked.
Right.
You see, it was real. So that's and I say you have to have experience, but if it's not your experience, it's not your truth. Well, that became my truth at that point, and that was probably one of the reasons when I saw the little sign for transcendental meditation, I was up for it. Mm-hmm. I said, that's really good, because I had done this with my mind. So in any case, that was the kind of the beginning of where I had a foot in both camps, the metaphysical camp. And metaphysics to me is just those sorts of things that aren't physical, those sorts of things that you can't measure, So you've got the reality of all the stuff you can measure, and then you've got metaphysics, which is everything else. And suddenly this other metaphysical world, to me, here's a whole nother big piece of reality that I didn't even know existed. Mm-hmm. Well, how does it work? What are the boundaries? Why does it work? What else can I do besides deprogram things? What is this? So a physicist, what we do is we model reality. We want to understand how things work and come up with models of how things work. So I was, kind of driven to not only use this skill, but understand it. Yeah. So then when I met Bob Monroe, who was just building a lab to study consciousness, I was interested. I was immediately, yes, I went in, I want to do this. But I said, Bob, I'll be your resident scientist, and what I want from you is you teach me how to go out of body like you do, and because if I don't experience it, then, I haven't learned, it's not going to help me. Mm-hmm. I can study you, and I can study all sorts of things about what happened to you when you do it, but that's really not what I'm as interested in as I am, finding out, what is it?
If it's not your experience, it's not your truth, right?
Exactly. So Bob agreed, and it wasn't just me. It was myself and another guy, Dennis Menerick, that both worked at the same place, both met Bob at the same time. And so anyway, that was the agreement. And for the next, 5 or 6 years, Dennis and I met with Bob on an average probably, 20 hours a week. So it was like a half-time job. So it was a lot of time. And we would go out to the lab, and Bob would teach us best he could what he knew and how to go out of body. And Dennis and I started making lab equipment and measured and coming up with, experiments and things that we could do that affect, altered states of consciousness, and then try to map these altered states of consciousness. So all this went on, like I said, about half a 20 hours a week, about half time, for about 5 years. So that was a lot of time. A lot of hours got put in there. But after the first year and a half, both Dennis and I could go out of body whenever we wanted to. but we both had this idea of, we're doing all this stuff and we have evidence. We see things come back, like remote viewing, and we check it out and it's true. We practiced with healing, with other sorts of things. And we had tremendous amount of data that said what we were doing was real because it had real effects. But neither one of us really was quite sure about it from an emotional viewpoint. That a deeper level, you don't quite get to the same point that you do with your intellect. The intellect said, all right, data says we're doing something real here. That's nice, but is this stuff really true? Yeah. Or are we just lucky, or is something else happening, and you always have this sort of thing. And then eventually, I got to the point that I could no longer deny that. It was an experience. Dennis and I went out of body together and we interacted, and there was just no way to explain that. So that was the moment when the second big aha for me was to get it at the real, how can I say it? I guess the emotional, at the being level, that you knew what you were doing was fundamental.
Yeah.
That there wasn't some other trick of mind or some other coincidence or some other kind of process going on, but what you were doing was fundamentally real.
Can you go into that?
That was a big one.
A little bit, Tom, about y'all's experience where you went out together just a little bit?
Oh, sure. I can talk about that. Like I say, I think we were about 1.5 years into this process with Bob. Dennis and I were, and Dennis and I always worked together. We'd come out to the lab and we'd come out after work. So it'd be like, 6:30 or something in the evening. We'd stay until about, 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. And then we'd go home and get maybe an hour or two sleep. I didn't get many of those because I'd go home and I was so buzzed up by it that I was still practicing when I got home, so then it was time to get up and go to work. So it was like that for these 5 years. And, anyway, one time when Dennis and I came out, we got up to the lab. We worked on equipment for an hour or two before Bob came up, and Bob came up and said, I've got something, I'd like you to try. So we said, sure, what? And he told us to go out of body, meet above the lab in the air. We just meet up with each other and then stick together. Go out on an adventure, do an out of body trip, but don't come apart from each other, stay connected. So we did that. And, for the next, hour and a half to 2 hours, we were on this adventure in a larger consciousness system, and we saw entities. We talked to them. We had conversations with each other. It was a fairly eventful, experience, set of experiences, which was pretty typical. We usually had eventful, experiences. If it wasn't eventful, if all you did is sit in a gray fog, there'd be really no way to tell whether that was the same gray fog or not. So there had to be a lot of things you did. Mm-hmm. And there were a lot of things. We came back and, Bob had recorded the things that we had said. He had taught us when we went out of body to be able to speak and describe to him what we were experiencing, because otherwise he wouldn't have any way to guide us into, how to deal with that or what to do, what to make of it, and so on. So he was able to guide us because we were able to let him know exactly what was happening to us all the time. So we were out of body, but we still had vocal cords and, that we could talk. And after a while, that just got to be very natural. However you train, is natural. If you don't train doing that, you'd find that very difficult to do. But it was very easy for Dennis and I. So he had 2 monologues, one of Dennis and one of I, and we were in separate rooms. Actually, there were 3 of these units. They were water beds in a small room, and they were both electrically and acoustically isolated. And there were 3 of them in a row, and I was in number 1, Dennis was in number 3, so there was a blank one between us. And all of them were acoustically isolated enough that you could shout, very loudly in one of them, and you really wouldn't hear anything except a little muffled, something like that. You couldn't understand it, whatever. And Dennis and I, when we're out of body, we're talking very softly. We had mics that were suspended from the ceiling within an inch or so of our lips. So we were talking very quietly into these mics. After all, we're not really there. The body's just working, sort of on its own as we direct it. But, so we got out and Bob had these 2 monologues, one of Dennis and one of I, that were taken completely independently and separately. And he put both of them on the these are cassette tapes. So he put them both in the player and turned them on at the same time. So they started at the same time. And there were Dennis and I having a conversation with each other on this tape. You know, I'd ask a question, Dennis would answer it, you know, and vice versa. We were obviously interacting with each other. Of course, neither one of us could have heard each other. And the things we saw, the things we did, the people we met, all of it was just obvious as anything that we were both having the same experience. Just as we both saw when we were out of body, there it was on the tape. So that was kind of the big, hit me between the eyes like a two-by-four, as they say. And I was kind of stunned by that, probably for a couple of weeks, because that was the emotional getting it, at the deep level. So I kind of remember, for a couple of weeks anyway, just constantly repeating over and over, like, my God, this is real. I kept saying that, because there's no other explanation. You see, that couldn't be some kind of trick of the mind or some sort of, not even a telepathic thing, because we both had the same experience, you see. So that was a big moment for me. And it wasn't as big a moment for Dennis. Dennis later on had another thing that hit him hard like that as well. But that was because almost every night that we were there, we experienced things that were, wow, exclamation point. Having big things happen that you couldn't explain wasn't a big deal anymore after a year and a half. That was just kind of, oh yeah, okay, gee, that was weird, but you didn't get particularly excited about it because everything was very unusual. So this was, in Dennis's mind, was just another really unusual, neat thing that happened, but he wasn't just ready, I guess, at that point to get to take the emotional hit that I did. And like I say, he did have something later that did the same thing for him.
So here you are, Tom. You're this left brain kind of, hey, if we can prove it, then it's real. If not, then it's not type of guy. And then you have these experiences, first with the meditation, then with Bob Monroe, and you guys are taking scientific data from this, and you have these epiphanies and these revelations like you're speaking of here. And this kind of like rounds you out into like, wow, you see maybe this left brain scientist has now all of this extra information that can't really be denied. So where did you take this after that, Tom? What are some of the things that you begin to put in place for your big toe to eventually emerge? What are some of the scientific revelations that you had, and how does this fit into the narrative of physics?
Well, it's a really good question. From then on, I was kind of the theorist of the group, of all the people that came out and was working with Bob. My part was to try to figure out how did it work? What were the boundaries? At least that's the job I assigned to myself anyway, because, I'm a physicist. That's what I do. That's how I think. And, yes, I had data, and for me, everything had to be proven, rationally. I had to understand it. Otherwise, I knew stuff was there, but if I couldn't really understand it and rationally get to it, then it was just amazing data, like a big pile of data, but I really didn't know what to do with it, how to sort it, how to make sense of it. So I collected this data, and it took a very long time because the beginning, like I say, was early 1970s. The books, My Big Toe, which is when I finally thought I understood it enough to actually explain it to somebody else, in a rational way. That's 2003. And there's a lot of years between, 1973 and 2003, you see. So it took a while for this to gel and figure out. And what I was doing a lot of that time was just experimenting. You do things, something happens, you have an experience, something happens, and then you want to know, well, how does that work? For instance, you kind of go back in time, okay? You can time travel in this state. You can go forward or backward in time. So you go backward in time and you have some interaction, and you interact with the beings there and so on. And I'm thinking, well, how does that take place? What is this about time? Is everything always going on all the time? Is the past never the past? Is everything, there is no time? Seth said that, there is no time. So on, I think about that, but that didn't really make any sense. A scientist listens to that and they say, nah, it doesn't make any sense. Just doesn't compute. Right. So I started doing some experiments there, and I would go to the same historical spot that I started before. And you have to have pretty good facility with your consciousness in order to make things repetitive. If you're just a beginner, you can't go back to where you were before. Everything is a first time and it's always new and you're really not in control. It's kind of spontaneous and you don't have that. But by then I had enough control that I could go exactly where and how I wanted to go and experience the same thing. So I'd go to that exact same place and I'd start out the interaction with the exact same, start. Like I'd say the same thing, ask the same question. I'd try to duplicate it exactly. And I found out that all the rest of it, all the flow from there on duplicated exactly. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, that's odd. People aren't that exact. If it's just a bunch of people and you walk into a group of people and you say, hi guys, what's going on? Did you see the ball game? Well, if you go back and do that again, like Groundhog's Day where the guy kept going back and doing it again. If you go back and say that same thing to that same group of people, you'll get slightly different answers. You won't get exactly the same thing every time. Well, I found out I did get the exact same thing every time. So then I'd start getting it with something similar, but just a little different. And then I'd find I'd get something a little different, but that little difference was connected to the little difference that I had made, you see. Mm-hmm. So eventually, after enough of this research and going round and round and doing this, 50 times, 100 times, whatever it took, I realized that it's more like I was going into a library. I was going into a space where there was data that had been saved, and the data had all the possibilities that might spring from any given moment. Mm-hmm. So here we are in a moment with these people in this situation, and I come in and I put a piece of data in, and there are so many different reactions to that data can have, and they're all probability. And then I realized that I could specify the probability. I could go in and I'd say, okay, I want to get the most probable reaction of everybody, and that's kind of the default value. And I went through it and I said, okay, now I want the second, not the most probable. I want the second most probable value from everybody. Got something different. You see, it was similar but different. And then the third most, I got something different again. And I say, I'm querying a database. That's what this is like. I'm putting out a query. It's aligning up the data based on what my query is. And if my query is exactly identical, between two times, I get exactly the same result. But if my query is a little different, and that's another thing that a beginner can't do. Usually or doesn't do very well. Usually their queries aren't very precise because the query is with your intent. And most people's intent's kind of flying around. It's not that stable. The intent's moving around this way and that. And you have intents that are kind of deeper in your being level, not in your intellectual level, that you don't even know about, that color your intent. So even though you didn't say it, well, you were interested in it or you meant it, at another level. And because you're kind of confused with multiple levels and things that aren't stable and flying around, it's really difficult to repeat an intent or to be very precise with your intent. Mm-hmm. But I could do that after, years with Bob Monroe and then practicing on my own. So those kinds of experiments then led me to understand more of how it worked, that it was about information. And you see, most people think I did this the other way. Most people think, well, physics these days is a lot about information. A lot of physicists are now saying reality is best described by information. And that's kind of an in thing. Well, people would think, well, I started there and then kind of derived the metaphysics based on a basic concept that everything is information. Didn't work that way at all. I started from the metaphysics. I found out it was information because of the experiments I could do in the larger reality frame. Mm-hmm. That's how I found out it was information. And at that time, there weren't any physicists anywhere who said reality or information. That's kind of a new thing. Only in the last decade has that become more and more of the standard, or the traditional physics viewpoint now is moving toward reality as information. Okay? Because that makes sense. All their experiments are pushing and shoving them into that reaction. But even when I wrote the books in 83, I Googled and researched as best I could and only found 2 other people who were scientists who ever mentioned the word in public, information, that reality was information. It was not a big idea at that time. It was a very radical, out on the fringe, nobody really paid much attention to it idea back then. And so it actually the metaphysics came first. And the interesting thing is, after I had the metaphysics figured out as to how the larger consciousness system worked, it was only then that I looked at all the metaphysics and said, gee, you know what? This describes physics too. The same things, the same concepts that describe the larger consciousness system, the larger reality, well, these same ideas are good physics. They describe how, quantum mechanics works, and they describe, why relativity is the way it is. They describe the basics of modern physics too. So it really, the metaphysics led, and I derived the physics out of the metaphysics instead of the other way around, which is what most people assume because I'm a physicist, that I'd start with the physics and somehow kind of did a derivation of explaining metaphysics with the physics, but it actually went the other way around. So it was a long journey, and little bit by little bit, I kind of teased out the details of what the restrictions are, what you could do. And it's just like any science. You try to eliminate all the variables but one, then you do experiments around that one variable, change that variable and see what changes. And you have to do it 50 times before you make sure that it's not some sort of error. And it's particularly when you're doing this all inside your head, you see, because you realize that there may be errors. You may not be as steady as you think. It may be some other thoughts coming through. So to make sure, you have to do it over and over again to where you feel very confident that the results are real. That's the way it is. So I found out a lot of basic things about how reality worked by doing experiments, by doing good science, the same way good science is done anywhere. Hypothesis, experiment, repetition. And then sometime around I think it was probably 97 or so, a friend was over at my house, and we had talked a little bit about metaphysics, and he says, well, Tom, tell me, how does all this work? What's the mechanism here? How does this larger conscious system work? So I tried to explain it to him, and 4 or 5 hours later, we were both so tired we couldn't go on, and I realized that what I was telling him was really pretty fuzzy. It wasn't really tight, logically. There were holes in it. So I thought, I gotta write this down. Because when you write, it forces you to be consistent and coherent. You can speak kind of fuzzy in your language, and other people kind of read between the lines and, yeah, I get it and I know what you mean sort of thing. But until you write it down, it's not as precise. It's a fuzzy thing. Well, writing it down forces clarity. A sentence only, it means what it says, right? You can't, have a lot of fuzzy sentences. That's terrible writing. So I wrote it down. It was about 8.5 pages long. And I said, this is it. I've got it written down. And, I passed it around to some people. They looked at it, their eyes rolled up in their head, and it was like, what is all of this about? So I realized that was too dense. I needed to have more explanation. I needed to have it so that people could understand it. So I'd take their questions, the things that they didn't understand, and I'd write to answer those questions. And I'd pass it around, and then I'd get questions, and I'd write to answer those questions, and I'd pass it around. And eventually I said, geez, I got enough here for a book. And then I kept doing this a little more, and then it was, geez, I got way too much for a book. What am I going to do with all this? It's going to be a 1,000-page book. And then I decided to make a trilogy out of it and break it into 3 pieces. So it was not so totally intimidating. Just like nobody will go watch a 3-hour, blog or something on that you're going to present. Nobody's going to pick up a 1,000-page book either. Mm-hmm. So I broke it into pieces. And as I wrote these pieces and as I tried to get more clarity into my thinking, I learned a lot of things in that process because I was kind of specifying and saying, here's my problem. Here's what I don't know. This is the hole I've got. And then I'd focus on that. Whereas before, I didn't really know where the problems were. I just I kind of get it and I sort of know what it's about, but it wasn't that tight. It wasn't, there were still things that needed to be filled in, and I discovered these things that needed to be filled in as I tried to write it down and realized there were certain places where I knew the answer, but I didn't know exactly logically how to get there. So then I had to figure out, well, what was the answer? Why was this like that? I knew it was like that, but why? So I'd have to fill that in. So it was a big learning process for me in the writing. The writing took about 5 years. It's about how long I was writing it. And,
so Tom, how would you describe the nature of science and kind of the Western view of the nature of reality right now versus the things that you've learned? And you talk about there being 3 paradigm shifts that will occur within science or within our collective understanding. What are those paradigm shifts, and how does that kind of relate to where we are now?
Okay, well, science has moved quite a bit toward my big toe in the last decade. And my big toe has been out for about a decade. That book was published, about a decade ago, decade and a year now. And in that time, science has shifted dramatically toward accepting reality as information. Now, that's still probably not the majority of physicists, but before it was almost no one. And now it's probably like 25-30%. You see, the physicists say, yeah, that's a good description. And it's growing. And the reason it's growing is because that's where their experiments are taking them. That's what the experiments say. You see, when I was in high school, I was told that an atom was a solid, positive, ball of mass, and that there was an electron that was orbiting around it. And this electron was a little chunk of mass with a charge. And it orbited because it had a negative charge and the nucleus had a positive charge, and that's what an atom was. Okay, so that was the idea. The nucleus is like this basketball-sized thing, and the electron is like this little BB, and it's flying around it, you see. And that's what everybody thought. That was scientists' best guess at what an atom was like, you see. Now, today, we realize that, that wasn't right. It's not like that at all. Now, even if you look at an elementary school science book, you'll see a picture of an atom, and it'll be this nucleus still there, but the electron is now a cloud, a probability cloud. So even in elementary school and high schools, of course, they all see atoms now as this probability cloud of electrons. And of course the kids, when they read that, it doesn't really compute. They don't know, what is that? What is this, a probability cloud of electrons? It doesn't compute, but they're told that's the way it is, like it or not, that's the way it is. If you want to get a good answer on my test, that's the way it'll be. So they don't understand it, but they know that that's the way it is. No more little BBs, going around basketballs. We've kind of grown past that primitive idea of atoms. So now the physicists are saying, well, the electron isn't really a little chunk of mass, and it really doesn't have, a piece of charge. Think of it as a point with the properties of mass, or the attributes of mass, and the attributes of charge. Well, that's very esoteric, right? That's kind of out there. And, that's the way they're looking at these things now. They're realizing that the particle world of little massy chunks felt good back when everybody was thinking in terms of Newtonian physics. Mm-hmm. But it just doesn't make sense anymore. So if you think of an electron as a point with attributes, how does that differ from modeling an electron in a computer? Doesn't differ at all. That's how you model an electron in a computer. It's a point and it's got attributes. It's got attributes of charge and attributes of mass. So they're beginning to get to the point that they see it's just information. Mm-hmm. That they don't think of these things as little chunks of mass anymore. At least the ones that are kind of at the forefront, the best of the physicists who are on the edge. That's the way they're thinking. So physics has changed a lot in that sense because their experiments have drugged them kicking and screaming into this viewpoint of reality as information. Mm-hmm. All right. Now, the paradigms that physics needs to surmount or delete, the first is one that's underway now. That's that reality is information. Okay. And we're getting there. That one's, like I say, probably 20-30% of the physicists are in that camp now. The rest will come along later. And the younger ones coming up will take to that probably more immediately. The second thing that will have to understand, once they get that, you see that you think that reality is information, is that this is a virtual reality. Once you understand that our reality is just information, then you realize that this is a computed reality. That's what it means to be a reality is just information. You see, that's the logic of it. If reality is just information, then our reality is computed. It's a simulation because that's what a reality that's just information is. It's a simulation. Okay. If we simulate something, then that computer model, you see, has things at locations with attributes. There's not really mass inside the computer model representing, little particles. It's just points with attributes. So when they make that kind of a description of reality, they're actually making a description of a computer simulation. So that's the next big thing they'll have to say is, it's not only just information, but this is a simulated reality, a virtual reality. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, when they get to virtual reality creates a big problem for physicists, which is why it's so hard to get them to say that. That's why it's going to be such a big paradigm shift when they make that shift. Because once you have a virtual reality, the question comes up, well, who's computing it? Where's the computer? Who wrote the program, you see? If it's a simulation, then somebody had to simulate it. Somebody's the programmer and somewhere there's the computer, right? Because a virtual reality cannot compute itself, right? There's a beginning problem with that, with logic, A virtual reality doesn't compute itself. It can't. How can it start itself when it doesn't exist, you see? So, very elementary logic creates this problem. If it's all information, then logic says it must be a virtual reality. If it's a virtual reality, then it must be computed elsewhere, not here. Because the virtual reality is a different reality frame than the frame in which it was created. And you have lots of questions about, well, where's this frame in which it has to be created? So then the next big thing after that, the next big paradigm shift is to realize that consciousness is the computer. Okay. That there's this larger consciousness system, and that's the computer. And that our particular reality wasn't programmed like we might program, The Sims virtual reality, but it was evolved. That it started with a rule set. It started with initial conditions, a whole lot of energy and pressure and temperature in a little space. And then you hit the run button, and according to the rule set, that stuff expands and coalesces, and you end up with suns and planets and whatever, and then you end up with cells, and then you end up with fish and lizards, and then eventually people, and so on. So all of that just evolved. So it's an evolving virtual reality. It's continuing to evolve, and it did that inside what I call the larger consciousness system. Of course, then we have a question, well, where did the larger conscious system come from? What's its mom and dad? Where did it come from? And at this point, you have to realize that there is a limit to information that's available to us because of where we are. And in one of my videos that I think was called Physics, Metaphysics, and Metaphysics, Physics, and the Nature of Consciousness. It was the first lecture I did in London, and it's on the YouTube set, and it takes some time to talk about this limits of knowledge. In that video, I talk about imagine bacteria in your intestine. What can it know of how food is produced? Sunshine, rain, whatever, tractors, trucks, refrigerators, all that stuff that's there necessary to the process of you swallowing food, that the bacteria in your intestines, that's what they do is work on that. They can't know about those things. It's just outside of their ability to know. Well, we are consciousness. How can we go out and get an objective look at what's outside of consciousness? You see, you can't see outside yourself. The child doesn't observe itself being born. You see, you can't get there. So that's just impossible to do. That's a fundamental limitation on our knowledge. We are consciousness. So when we start saying, well, okay, where did this larger conscious system come from? We're asking a question for which there can be no logical answer. It's just theory. It can't be. Well, we can have conjecture. We can say, well, maybe it's some other system had a big computer just like we have World of Warcraft and they did us, and we're just this and somebody else's. Well, then who did them? You see, and it backs back up to where you have to start with consciousness just evolved. Mm-hmm. From what? Well, another name for evolution these days, we have a new name for it that sounds a lot sexier than evolution. It's called emergent complexity. And it's been shown that if you have a system that has the potential to become more than it is, you just start it with random components, but it has the potential to become more, that eventually it will, all by itself, on its own complexity, will emerge. And why does it emerge is because things at first just randomly happen to bump together that create something that's useful. You see? And that thing that's useful then gets used as a tool or as a pattern to create another thing, maybe like it or maybe similar, or maybe you use it as a tool to do something else, but it just builds upon itself. And that is the emergent complexity. So they've done this, in several ways. If you Google emergent complexity, you'll find a bunch of research that has shown that if you just take systems and they don't have anything really going in them, there's no structure, there's nothing there but potential. That potential will begin to evolve into something else, and complex systems then can happen based on that. So that's where I start with consciousness. I say you can't just say exactly where the consciousness system came from, because we're consciousness and we just don't get to see that. It's not in our, ability to answer that. Just like the bacteria in your stomach can't really tell you about how the food, got to the intestine. It can just tell you all about the food once it gets there, but it can't tell you anything about it because it's just outside of where it has the ability to perceive. Well, that's the way we are with this. So we start with emergent complexity, and we say there was a potential that had the possibility of being aware that it could exist in this way or that way, that there was just a difference, some kind of a difference between this and that it had two states that it could be in. Well, if it can be in two, it can be in three, it can be in four, because it can be in sets of two, and so on, and that eventually it evolved because it was able to create patterns with its differences. Now, what's the difference? This and that, that's a 1 and a 0. You see, I'm talking about information. So this is a system that could evolve information. Everything is information, so we don't expect consciousness really shouldn't be anything more than information, and consciousness is an information system. So information is like the fundamental thing of reality. The fundamental thing of all existence is information. Everything else is built up out of information. So this potential system, where did this potential system come from? Can't tell. So you admit ignorance rather than making something up to make you feel better. Rather than making up a belief about it, you just admit ignorance and say, don't know. But all we need is a potential that can differentiate a 1 from a 0, a this from a that, good from bad, acid from base, whatever you want to say, just some differential. And if it could do that, then it could evolve that into more information. It becomes a big information system. Okay. As a large information system, what drives it? Well, what drives it is lowering its entropy. Entropy is a measure of disorder. High entropy means lots of disorder. What that means is all you have is randomness. Nothing. Well, the emergent complexity, what it does is it lowers entropy. Systems evolve to lower their entropy. That means you create structure. You create patterns. You create things that are useful to you. Why are they useful? Because they help you decrease entropy more. You see? So that's what was going on, and things tend to do that naturally all by themselves. If you just take a system, it'll tend to do that. If it has the potential to do it, it will. So that tells you a lot of things that you can look at the logical consequences just from that idea. We have scientists have been working for decades on AI, artificial intelligence, and they would love dearly to create some sort of artificial consciousness, right? But they're trying to make it. You see, they're trying to produce it, and they say, well, how do you make it? What algorithms, what code do I write to make a consciousness? You don't make it. It evolves. What you have to do is create an environment in which it can evolve. Then get out of the way and let it evolve, you see. So it's a different viewpoint. As long as they're trying to construct a artificial consciousness, if you will, or construct an artificial intelligence, they're very limited. They can't get past that point where it actually learns on its own, that it takes the initiative to do things. See, that's called free will, where it's doing things because that's what it wants to do. And they can't program the free will into the computer. That's something that evolves without the, programming. Now you can host a free will in a computer. That's not a problem. You just have to give it what it needs, and it will grow. It will evolve into that sort of thing. So that's kind of the idea of where physics is now. They've just gotten to paradigm 1, which is everything is information. Next thing is, this is a virtual reality. Oh my God. Where did it come from? Where's the computer and who programmed it? And then the third one is consciousness is the computer. And I guess the last thing is to realize we can't go any further back than that, because we are consciousness, and we cannot get outside and see ourselves being started. You see, it just doesn't work that way.
So it seems like at this point, you're having two of these big entities starting to merge together. One being science and one being spirituality, for lack of a better term, I guess. And these things are starting to, what I got out of listening to your lectures and reading your books and stuff is that all of this stuff gelled together really nice and smoothly. And when you talk about lowering entropy, another way of putting that is evolving towards love, right? And you can look into these different esoteric or spiritual things that people have been saying for a long time, and they'll say, well, it's all about love, right? The Beatles would say love is all you need. And this actually begins to ring true with what we've found out in physics and with what we're doing here, lowering entropy. Is that correct, Tom?
Yeah, that's right. And the way that works is that, all right, we've kind of worked our way into this larger consciousness system, and it just evolved, and it got more and more complicated and more complex. Well, what sort of models do we have to look at how this works, this evolutionary process? Well, if we look at our own physical evolution inside this virtual reality, what do we have? We have basically a similar thing. We've got in this virtual reality, we've got a world that has potential, right? And you have some amino acids and come into contact, they get built up, and this is at the random part, like where the larger conscious system was just kind of randomness until it could understand of this and of that, and then it could start building things out of information. Well, we probably started like that too. There's a lot of randomness, and we got a cell. We got something that was, a functional thing. Something got created that could be used as a pattern, or could be used, as something else got created. We can build on that. Lower entropy. Now we've got things that were just random, and we've created something that isn't random. We've just lowered entropy a little bit. Good for us. So we want to build on this. Well, then eventually from one-celled things, you got multi-celled things, right? And from multi-celled things, you got things that were even more complex, and they had groups of cells had specialization. The circulatory, the defense, the various senses, so now you have groups of cells doing specialized things for the whole. Well, these are kind of the ways that our evolution worked. And it worked like that in the minerals as well as in the biology. You started out just with atoms. Well, now they bind together. They cooperate. They bind together. They get molecules. Molecules then bind together and, produce substances. These substances learn how to do different things, be different things. Some of them is wooden trees. Some of them are sandstone, where all the little particles of sand, have gone together to make a stone. So basically, our whole evolution of the planet, both biology and other, is this progress of things building upon the other, upon events. And it does that by small things go together, cooperate together, if you will, work together to make bigger, more complex things, which then go together to make bigger, more complex things. That's how, that's the emergent complexity, right? You build complexity. As you build complexity, you're eliminating randomness. You've got structure instead of randomness. That lowers entropy. So you see, that's the natural way these things go. So if we look at larger conscious system, it works the same way. It's going to have to work the same way because that's how a system lowers its entropy. So it starts out as this very simple system. It soon learns that it can lower its entropy better if it has something to interact with. So now it splits. It's like that single cell split, and now there's two cells. Well, two cells together can do more than just that one cell could do by itself. So now there's the interaction. You've added more degrees of freedom to the problem, more things that can be done, more ways in which you can construct. So you end up with multiple cells. Well, what are multiple cells of consciousness? Multiple chunks of consciousness. I call those individuated units of consciousness. That's what we are. You see, we're conscious beings. We're pieces of this larger consciousness system. And if you have all these chunks of consciousness, if you will, that can interact with each other, suddenly the way of the amount of novelty, the amount of ways that things can go together increases dramatically, you see, just like it did for the cells. So this is on the path of lowering entropy. So we're going to see this larger conscious system kind of break apart into pieces. The pieces are going to interact. Okay. Now here's where we find love. We have a system now that's a social system. Cells had the same sort of thing. We have this social system with individuated units of consciousness are interacting with each other. Social system. How do you optimize a social system? How do you get a social system to decrease its entropy? That's what I mean by optimize, to evolve in a positive direction, right? If you evolve, you get more structure, less entropy. You de-evolve, you get less structure, more randomness, you come apart. Well, the two opposite things here in a social structure is, on one side, it can be caring and cooperative and working together. On the other end, it can be, it's all about me, non-cooperative, not working together, but rather struggling between the pieces for dominance, or the pieces all working together, for the good of the whole. So you have these two different ways you can go about with these interactions between the pieces. And it's pretty obvious which one builds structure and which one, builds chaos, right? I mean, you don't have to be too smart to figure that out. So those that work together and cooperate were able to form in our biology multi-celled beings, because the individual cells, and you might call a cell a bacterium, the individual bacteria figured out how to work together to do something bigger. Okay. And that bigger thing now is more survivable and sturdier and whatever, because it's bigger, stronger than it was before. It's a bunch of things working together. That builds value. It lowers entropy. Well, the same here. So you have love versus fear. Love-based is what we call, caring, cooperative, working together. It's about other, not about self. That's the key. It's about other. So it's not just you at the center of the universe trying to grab as much as you can grab and hold on to it as best you can. It's you as part of a social system willing to work together so that everybody can do well. All right, those are the two things. Well, this is a love-based and a fear-based. And one of the examples I give of if you had two equal groups of individuals in an experiment, and here's a group of 10,000 people, and you put them in an environment with certain resources, and this is the love group, and they're going to work together with the resources they have and the talents they have to optimize what they have, and they care about each other. And you have another group, same 10,000 people, same people, duplicate of those people, same bunch of people, and same resources, but this is the fear group. They are very self-centered. They only care about making sure they get theirs and, as much of it they can get, and then they have to hold on to it because everybody's trying to take it away from everybody else. Okay, so you take those two groups and let them go for 20 years. What do you expect to have at the end of the 20 years? Well, in the love group, you expect that they will have optimized everybody there against the resources and will have done very well. They will have constructed and built and gained and invented and gone forward dramatically, because if somebody has a good idea, they share it with everybody else. They don't hold it and say, this is my idea. I'm going to use this against other people to make sure I get more. On the other one, what do you end up with after 20 years or so of that group? You end up with something that looks very much like we live in, You find out that because first they all fought each other, they realized then that they'd have to group together to have like mutual defense packs, so this group is going to protect each other, but they're going to go get this other group. So then you have bunches of subgroups here that are warring with each other, each trying to protect their own stuff and get the other person's stuff. And the whole thing is dysfunctional. You see? Mm-hmm. If somebody gets something, somebody else wants to take it away because they want it. If somebody has a good idea, they either keep it to themselves, otherwise it'll get ripped off. You see, they're not going to benefit for it, and it's all about them benefiting for it. Mm-hmm. So anybody has a misfortune or a problem, everybody else is kind of glad because it takes them out of the competition rather than going out and helping that person. Well, that doesn't build, you see. That tears down. It's hard to build up anything in that. As soon as you build it up, others want to tear it down. So what you do is you coalesce into bigger and bigger units, you see, for self-protection. And of course, they'd like to take each other down too, but they can't because they're all, that's the mutual, what do we call it? The mutual assured destruction, right? That we have, in our current society, that's what you get to. You see, that's the end point of that kind of a thing. So it's obvious that if we talk about consciousness has a purpose, and that's to evolve. How it does that is by lowering its entropy. How do you lower entropy? The interactions are love-based. That's the optimal for lowering entropy. So that then gets us back, what's the purpose of consciousness? What's the purpose of all these IUOCs, these individuated units of consciousness? They're to evolve toward becoming love, because that optimizes the system. You see? So that's the point of it. We've got a long way to go. We look more like that other bunch, but anyway, so that's how it all comes together. So we realize that consciousness, that's kind of the last paradigm shift, is that we said that consciousness is the computer, and then the next paradigm shift after that is that love, is the purpose. Love is where we're going. So once we get to that final paradigm shift that people see that all this works like this, then love is the answer. That's how you win this game. That's what you're here to do. That's your purpose and point. And it's about other, not about you, because about you is that destructive game that raises entropy. So now, if we got to that paradigm, I think the world would be a better place, because people would kind of see what's going on. Now, what they look at and what they see is that if I don't grab what I can grab and hold on to it, I'm a loser, I'm going to get ground up in this system. So that kind of perpetuates itself. So that's the thing. We've got these paradigm shifts. We finally get to that last paradigm shift, then we will be a much kinder, gentler, happier, more progressive, and more advanced people. And that's kind of where we're going. And it's sort of inevitable. We're going that way. It's not inevitable in the sense that we can't screw up. We can, we can make this take a very, very long time. We can self-destruct many times and reconstruct and self-destruct and reconstruct. Hopefully, eventually, that's where we're going, because the whole system is headed that way. And we, as individuated units of consciousness, are really just part of the strategy of the larger consciousness systems to evolve. We're part of that system. So we're just pieces. So now suddenly in metaphysics, we're all one. That makes sense. We're all one. You see, and, love is the answer, of course. It's all about love, well, that makes sense because it's a social system and and we're lowering our entropy. So it all starts to make logical sense. What was before kind of hand-waving, metaphysics, that in your heart and in your being you knew it made sense, but you couldn't really put it into a logical format that it made sense to a left brain, logic. So now it does. It just all comes together and makes sense. Well, here we are in this virtual reality. I'm going to take you to your other part of your question. Here we are in this virtual reality. And to make this virtual reality work, there's some things that you need to do to make it work. One, you need to, because it's a big calculational thing. You can imagine this is, big virtual reality here. You have to track everything that's going on. It's like World of Warcraft, right? Except it's got 7 billion players. And the players are a lot more complex than the ones in World of Warcraft. So there's a lot to track here. So we need some economies. One of them is you don't have to track all the details, all the particles. It's not like you track all the atoms and all the molecules to see what they're going to do next. You don't really care about that. You do this in terms of probability. You make it a probability model, not a deterministic model, because it's not deterministic. So a probability model now is so much easier, so much quicker, and works good enough for you to run this virtual reality. So now it's about probability, not about all the molecules and all the atoms and all the elementary particles building up and doing that. That's not how things work. They work based on probability. And in order to anticipate what's going to happen next, so that the rendering engine, if we talk about a virtual reality being rendered by some, computer rendering engine, then the rendering engine has to have some idea what's coming up next so it can get prepared, right? So it knows what's going on. So it also progresses forward the probable future, what's likely to happen, so that it can get ready for it and have kind of everything in line to keep everything flowing. So we have a future probable database. It's also important to learn to keep track of the history. What did happen? Because if you don't have any history, then it's like every day is a brand new start. It's hard to learn if you don't have any history that you can understand, right? So there's this past database, which is all the things, you have all the things that could possibly happen and the probability that they might. That's this future probable database over here. Then as time ticks along, something actually does happen. All these individuated units of consciousness do interact and do something because they have free will. Okay, that's what did happen. But there's a whole lot of things that could have happened but didn't. So here in the past database, you've got all of that. You've got everything that actually did happen and everything that didn't happen but could have, and the probability. And we talked earlier when I said I went in and I was in the past and I saw that this is just a probability, it's like querying a database. That's what it is. But the system needs these databases in order for it to function. Now, the one other thing that you need to know here is that there's a time. Time in this virtual reality is the loop time for computing the virtual reality. So you make a simulation of something. In that simulation, you have a time. Time equals t, right? And every time you loop through, you add a delta t to the last time. And then you go through, calculate, and add a delta t. That's how World of Warcraft and Sims and everything, they're dynamic simulations. They go on a time loop. Well, that's our time. That defines time in this virtual reality. It's basically the loop time of the simulation, that outer loop. Okay, now, the time in the larger consciousness system goes a lot faster. See? So it has basically billions and billions of cycles to compute, to do whatever in just one delta t of our virtual reality. So it's not like this thing, how could it keep up with all the action going on here? You see, that would be awful. Well, it's got a lot of cycles. When I do it, if I'm making a simulation of a missile flying through the air, you see, I have a delta t, and I make that delta t just as small as I want it to be so that I catch this missile here, and then here, and then here, and then here. The missile moves. Digital things, everything moves in little jumps. You see, it's not continuous. It's digital. Okay? So I can make that delta t as small as I want, but I don't want to make it any smaller than I have to because it takes more processor time, right? Mm-hmm. I can make that delta t, 1/100th of a second, or I could make it 1/1,000,000th of a second or 1/1000,000th of a second. And each one of those, I get finer little steps with the 1/1000,000th of a second. Well, I got a whole lot more computing to do. So you only make the delta t as small as you need it to be because that gets you your answer with the least amount of processing time. Well, that's what it does. You see? So it's got a lot of cycles between our cycles for it to do these things. Okay, now that we have all of that, we see that we have a reality based on probability because that makes more sense. Trying to track every molecule and atom and elementary particle in this thing is a crazy thing to do from a computer science standpoint. Why would you want to do all that when you can just do a simple probability calculation? See, one of them is this real huge computer science problem, and the other one is a real easy computer science problem. So you do what's economical, what's easy. So from that, and because we have time is every delta t, you see, and that is likely to be a constant because you wouldn't want time going fast and slow and fast and slow. You want your reality to be consistent. Well, now you look at that. Now all of this is coming basically from the metaphysics, from consciousness. How would consciousness evolve? Pieces. The pieces together. Love. Well, the pieces need to interact with each other, right? That's the thing. Well, how do they do that? Well, if all they're doing is exchanging data, that's very limited. Put them in a virtual reality where they actually interact, with a much tighter rule set. So we create the virtual reality because that forwards the evolution of the system. So virtual reality has just evolved to be a learning space for the individuated units of consciousness. And you're going to have probability of what's going to happen next, things based on probability. It's got this delta t that goes around. Well, what we've just done is derived quantum mechanics and relativity. Relativity is based on the fact that c is a constant, c being the speed of light. Okay, that's it. Once you know c is constant, a little algebra, not even that hard, just algebra, not even calculus, just algebra will get you to special relativity. Okay? Special relativity will take you to, general relativity. So the whole thing is based on this one idea that c is a constant. And that's what Albert Einstein started with. C is a constant. See, that doesn't make any sense. Why should it be a constant? Everything else, speeds add. But light, it doesn't. It's a constant. All right. So out of that idea, well, of course light, speed's a constant because you have this virtual reality. Think of it as a delta t, right? That's the delta t. Okay, now speed is distance per time. Now you have a delta v, which is a unit of volume, and you expect all your units of volume should be equal, the same, a constant. Otherwise it'd be like your screen if all your pixels weren't the same size. So you had big pixels and little pixels. You see, your picture would be real distorted, right? It wouldn't be a very useful picture. Well, so you expect all the delta v's to be constants. Well, you take a delta V volume, take the cube root of it, and you've now got a distance, right? Because distance times distance times distance is volume. That's just the way 3 dimensions work. So now you got a distance, and that distance is going to be basically constant. That delta T is constant. You take that delta distance, divide it by the delta T, and you have the speed at which something can move from cell to cell to cell to cell. A cell being a little delta L, a little delta V, delta L, delta L, delta L. If you think about cubes, it'd be that sort of thing. So that's the speed. It can only go from this piece of volume to the next piece of volume in 1 delta T. In other words, it can't skip. It's got to go consecutively through the steps. You can't have it in this volume and then the next delta T, it's way over here. That's called teleporting. That's again, gives you a weird reality that isn't buttoned down. So it can only go one chunk of volume for 1 delta T. Well, take the delta X divided by delta T, you get the speed of light. That's why speed of light has to be a constant. Because that's the maximum speed that you can move something through this virtual reality. Ta-da! You've just given the basis of relativity. You see, and to physics right now, they have no idea why C is a constant. See, that C is, they know it is because relativity works. They've done the experiments. The experiments say, yeah, C is a constant because we measure this stuff, and sure enough, all the things relativity says work out that way, so C is a constant. But they have no idea why that ought to be true. So here, this metaphysics, you see, derives why C has to be a constant. Mm-hmm. Now we go to quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics, as its basis, has this concept that particles really aren't particles at all. Like I say, we've given up on particles as these little chunks of mass. Now particles are just probability distributions. It's a probability that there's an electron from this distance to that distance. They're probability functions. That's what they are fundamentally. And then of course you say, well, of course they are. Our whole reality is based on probability. We have a future probable, reality. So you have future probable particles. They're not in this virtual reality yet. They're just future probable particles. They're probability distributions. You take a measurement, you get a particle. Now that particle acts like a little massy particle in your virtual reality. It's a virtual particle now because you made the measurement. That's the way virtual realities work. Virtual reality only renders what you measure, what you need. Mm-hmm. You see, they don't render things just for fun. If you go into Sims and you're inside your house as a Sims and you're not looking out a window, it's not rendering what's outside to that character, to that consciousness. It's only rendering what's inside, right? That character walks outside and it's only rendering what's in his view. He turns around, looks the other way, it renders something different. So you only get rendered what you measure. Okay, what's your senses? Go out and measure. That's the only thing that gets rendered. And that would make sense. Take away our senses and what do we have left? Nothing, as far as our virtual reality goes. So here we started with metaphysics. We started with a consciousness system. We understand how evolution works. We understand that it's evolving because it wants to lower its entropy. Then we understand that means love is the answer. We understand that virtual reality is required to help the pieces evolve, interact with each other with more feedback, more direct feedback than they get just in a telepathic, shuffling the data. And then we find out that this virtual reality and consciousness provide the fundamental answers to the question, why is C constant? Why are particles probability distributions? It's just natural. That's what they have to be, you see. So now we have derived the two big problems in physics, which is why does relativity work? Why should C be constant? And why should particles be probability distributions? We know that they act that way, but, why is that? So it's, like I said, the physics actually came after the metaphysics. Mm-hmm. I didn't start with physics in mind. I started with trying to explain consciousness and a theory of consciousness and reality, and got to the point that I could see that it all was information because of my research. And then once the whole model started to pull together, it just made sense. And all of the things that modern physics, are doing, the problems that they have, Why is how is it that the universe is expanding? Real big problem. Well, if the universe is all, if in the usual physics or scientist's viewpoint, our universe is all the reality there is. There is nothing outside of our universe. Everything is physical and the universe contains it all. Well, then how does our universe expand? What's it expanding into if there's nothing there? How can it expand? How can it be a dynamic expanding thing? Big problem, you see, because there's a logical difficulty with that. Well, it's easy. It can expand. That's just a number in a computer. It's as big as, it can expand until you've got a number so big the computer can't handle the number, and we're a long, long way from that. Okay? But it's not only expanding, it's accelerating. Well, why would it be accelerating? Well, the amount of space or the size of the universe that you have to calculate in a virtual reality is only as much as the people there, the players in the virtual reality can measure. Okay, so as your players get clever and clever about making measurements that are bigger and smaller, you have to give them answers. So if they look at a electron microscope and they can see a molecule, well, what are you going to provide them? What are you going to render for them when they look at that microscope? Well, you're going to render a molecule. Okay, what are you going to look at? They get this great big telescope and they can say, oh, look, I can see all the way out there. You got to render them more space. And that keeps expanding. And it's not only expanding, but it's accelerating. Our technology, our ability to look at smaller and bigger things and understand is accelerating. I mean, look at the amount our technical ability has changed in the last 3 decades compared to the 3 decades before that and the 3 decades. You can see that it's expanding. That's because it evolves. Each time you make a discovery, that makes more discoveries easier to make, you see. Mm-hmm. So it just accelerates. Well, so does the detail that we need. So does the resolution of the virtual reality has to get tighter and tighter because people are making more and more detailed measurements and so on. So we can kind of see that what we have, the kind of the mysteries, we have lots of mysteries in science. We have one called tunneling. And tunneling, is such well, I'll tell you what tunneling is. If you got particles and those particles are contained, so I put these particles in what they call a potential well, but that just means they can't get out. Let's say they're, electrical particles. Their electrical potential is just not enough to get through the walls. And they can't get over them. They can't get under them. They can't get around them. They're trapped. Okay. Maybe you're trapping, magnetic, things in a magnetic field. They can't get out. So we put them in this potential well. And what we find out is that some of the time they turn out outside the well. They're over here. They got out somehow. And the word that science uses, they tunneled. Okay. Yeah, metaphor, right? So they tunneled out. Well, nobody thinks they really tunneled. They just appear out here. And they're not supposed to. But they do anyway. How's that happen? Well, you've got billions of particles in this bottle, that they shouldn't get out of the bottle. Well, all these particles have probability distributions. They're not particles, they're probability distributions. And what's the probability that you'll find them out here outside the bottle? Oh, very, very small. Maybe 1 in 100 million that they would do that. Random draw. 1 in 100 million, you'd find it out here. But you got 50 billion particles. So 1 in 100 million, you've got a bunch of particles out here that aren't supposed to be there. And we have electronic components called tunneling diodes that are in probably most of the electronic gadgets we all have. And, they help things work. This idea that you have this leaking charge that leaks out of this diode is an important part of how that works. So we use these effects, but we don't understand how that happens. Well, that's because the particles aren't particles, they're probability distributions. Another big mystery. Explain, how does that work? Why is tunneling like that? Well, quantum mechanics has figured that out. Quantum mechanics assumes they're probability distributions, and sure enough, they can compute the tunneling, you see. But they have no idea why they ought to make that assumption. So we can tell them it's a virtual reality and it's based on probability. That's the natural state of things, is there's probability distributions in this virtual reality. So that kind of goes all the way back into your question. We started with the metaphysics. We evolved it. in ways that are logical and rational, then we end up, when we're done, we say, well, this consciousness field is an information field. It's an information system. This is a virtual reality. It's created this virtual reality. We know why and how it had to do that. And the science falls out, the physics falls out, everything falls out, the metaphysics falls out. What did the Buddha mean when he said, we were all one and that all this physical world is an illusion? What's all that about? Well, now we understand that, you see. So it takes, and the religions, God is love, right? Well, this idea that love is the answer. Well, now that makes sense. So that's the key, is that we take this one concept of consciousness, is fundamental. Everything else is derived. And we suddenly can rationally see who we are, why we're here, what our purpose is, how science works, why you have relativity, why you have quantum mechanics, what the Buddha meant. You see, it all just pulls into one thing. Why you have tunneling diodes, lots of the mysteries, the things we knew in our heart but couldn't demonstrate, and a lot of our scientific mysteries now just all disappear under just this one idea, and it's only got two assumptions. The idea, you can make up a theory that'll tell you any answer you want, but whether a theory is good or not depends on how many assumptions it has. If you make lots and lots and lots of assumptions, you can derive a theory that tells you the pink elephants fly, right? Yeah. But it has to have a lot of assumptions to support that. And the assumptions are probably not too credible. This just has two assumptions in this theory, and one of them is that consciousness exists, which is not a big jump because we're conscious. All right, consciousness exists is not all that big a deal. And that evolution exists, which means systems change. Systems will change in such a way as to be more profitable to themselves. Things change. So then all you need is consciousness, which is a system that is self-changeable, and evolution that will take a self-changeable system and let it evolve to lower its entropy and become more. So you've got the potential, and you've got the mechanism for that potential to actualize itself. That's all you need. You don't need anything else. So you just have two very fundamental assumptions, and everything else then gets derived from that in a logical way. So yes, this is science. It really is science. There's no difference in the science in the My Big Toe theory than there is in the science in Darwin's evolution. Mm-hmm. It's the same sort of thing. He's got some basic principles. He derives all the stuff we see based on it. And then there's all these little logical, what do we call them? There's these little derived things that verify that the theory is right. Right. We can see evolution. We can look at the eggs and the fetuses and the things, and we can see how the evolution that we humans have tails when we're in that embryonic stage, and that so do frogs and chickens, and we look just about the same, and this differentiates and changes, and we can see how the dolphins and the whales actually have fingers, bones. They have bones like we have bones. They don't just have a fin with one bone going out for the fin. They've actually got fingers in that fin, so you can kind of trace how did they evolve? Well, they probably were on land and then went back into the water, and suddenly you can answer a whole lot of questions with Darwin's theory. Why are these moths black and these other moths are yellow, and you can figure out why, natural selection produced the variations that they did, and it gives it a logical explanation of why things are the way they are. And MBT does the same thing, except on a bigger scale. Now, Darwin and his whole, the whole physical universe now is just one little piece of something that's much bigger, because this is not the only virtual reality. There's lots of other virtual realities. We're not the only game in town, you see, and it's a much bigger system. And Darwin's thing now is just one little piece of one little piece of one little piece. But you see, it's still all it all works the same way. It's a fractal. If you look at a little piece, it shows you the same kind of stuff and the same kind of processes going on in the little piece as there is in the big piece. It's
that kind of goes to that esoteric saying, as above, so below, correct?
Yes. Yeah, we can there's a lot of things that people, and why would a little saying like that last for, who said that? I used to know.
Thoth?
Yeah, the name of the person that was his saying. But anyway, it goes way back to like ancient Greece or someplace. It's a saying that's been around for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Why would a little saying like that stay? I mean, why wouldn't people say, yeah, what does that mean? That's as above, so below. Forget about it. Because it rings a certain truth to people. People hear that and they go, yeah, that's true. There's fundamental principles, and the other stuff kind of falls out of those fundamental principles. So we got a sense that that's the way the world works and the way reality works. But we say these things and we say, yeah, love is the answer, and we're all one. We kind of know these things are right, but we don't really know why they're right and what we have to do with them.
One of the things that your big toe really does for me, and I think a lot of people, is it kind of helps that linear left side of our brain, or that left side of our being that's really kind of that question and answer type of side. We need to have proof, and this begins to really do some things, or it has the potential to do some things to really ease a lot of the turmoil that goes on within us, I think. Another thing that you talk about, Tom, a lot is to not necessarily take what you're saying to be a truth, or to believe it even. And one of the things that I also heard you say that I think is really important is that we don't, this is kind of just a model right here. Mm-hmm. The things that we're saying is a model, and I think it's easy to take something like this and go, oh, well, shit, great, like we're just ones and zeros sitting here in this infinite sign, and we're just doing this. But in reality, we got to bring in the reality in our experience and how beautiful this is, and how beautiful the combination in what you're saying, and we can take with our experience, how beautiful that can be, because what you're saying can take us to new heights, and to new places as far as love goes, as far as you say, lowering entropy. These things can, sometimes I get these thoughts and these feelings that are just beyond words with the beauty and with the love and the joy that we can feel. And I think integrating some of these ideas that you're saying, it helps. It can help a lot.
Yes, and it's good that you bring that up. This is a model. And don't ever confuse the model of reality with reality. Okay, this is a model of reality. When I talk about computers and information systems and memory and processing and delta T loops, these are metaphors. Okay, these are things to help us understand how things work. Now, when your model is a very good model, that means, I maybe should ask the question, what makes a model a very good model? Well, what makes a model good is that it answers all the things, or it derives all the things that you already know are true, plus it derives new things, new understandings that you didn't have before that you eventually can experimentally verify that they're true too. So a model has to work. It's not good just because somebody claims it's good. It has to actually work. It has to produce. It has to be useful. You see, but don't confuse a model with the thing the model is modeling. Reality and the model of reality are two different things. We do that all the time. Science does that all the time. Scientists only measure effects. See, no scientist has ever measured an electron. We measure the effects of electrons. We measure the effect, and then we assume the electron as the model to explain that effect. You see? But where we mess up, and where we continue to mess up, is that then we believe the models. Now we think there really is such a thing as an electron, a little chunk of mass, you see, with a charge on it, because that's our model of the effect. That's our model to explain the effect. And we start to believe in it. That's the problem. You see, should never believe that your model is the thing. It's just a model. There is no such thing as an electron. You see, we don't have electrons. They're just points with the attribute of mass and the attribute of charge. You see, we got all balled up with that, and there's still a lot of scientists today who think all these models that they have all the particle theory of matter, and have all these particles. All of those are just models and metaphors. Don't confuse that with reality. You see, it doesn't work that way. I just did I put a new video up on YouTube a week or so ago talking about the 10 the 10 beliefs, scientific beliefs. And Rupert Sheldrake put something up. It got a lot of notoriety because it got thrown off at TED Talks for being pseudoscience. So he went through these 10 things that scientists claim are truth and that they know that they really don't. These are just assumptions and beliefs of science. So he went through these 10, and evidently some of the scientists that control TED's budget or something. I don't know how all that worked, but somehow they didn't like that. But that's true. Science has all of these beliefs. There's no difference between religious belief and scientific belief. Belief is belief, and it's what gets in the way. Belief is what limits you from being able to see the truth. It's because you have belief. If you think you know it, you stop trying to find out. So we believe all these things. And of course, when I made this little thing about Rupert, of course, Rupert has a thing that he has championed called the morphic field. But fields are another belief. There are no such things as fields. And of course the scientists say, well, sure there are. Electric fields. Look, electric fields all over from all these radio stations, everything. I hold up my little electric field meter. Well, all you're measuring is information. You're getting information at a point in space, right? That's it. What's this field? You see, well, a field is just a way for us to imagine that something physical is going on because that makes us feel good. All a field is it's a field of information that we can measure at various places and points for various reasons, because over here's a magnet and over there's an electric generator, and so we got all these fields in a radio station, and we measure the field. It's the sum of all those fields, and of course it is. All that's being computed in a computer. You just measure a point. You see, so fields don't exist. Rupert didn't have that as one of his 10, but number 11 should have been fields. You see, they don't exist. All the particles don't exist. So we've got our whole world based on particles, right? All these particles go together. The little particles make the bigger particles, which finally make atoms, which make molecules, which make stuff. And our whole world is based on all these particles. All these particles is models. You see, we measure the effects. We make up a model, then we believe that it's real. So no, don't believe that this model is real. There's a difference between the model of reality and reality. These models tend to be metaphors. They tend to be descriptions that tend to explain what we do measure, which are the effects. Okay. But all we're measuring the effects. We're just like an elf in World of Warcraft or a person in The Sims. What do they measure? They just measure what their senses see. Well, our scientists have honed their senses with machines so we can see, deeper than what our physical senses are. We've got machines that extend our senses, but it's the same thing. You're only measuring an effect of something. And the model should not be believed. Okay, models are handy because they help you structure information in a way that you can talk about it and it makes sense. And that's what My Big Toe does. It structures information in such a way that we can talk about it. And it's valuable because now everything falls under this one big understanding. So it's a very useful context, if you will, a very useful model for understanding how the world works, what's our point in it, what's our purpose, how do we fit in, and basic science and all the rest of it falls out of it. So it's a useful model, but don't believe in it. Metaphors, So that's a very important point. And I tell that to people, but I think it really doesn't help. It doesn't make any sense. They believe it or disbelieve it anyway. They don't see it as as a model. Now the model may be very, very close to the real thing, you know, and if the model's really good, it probably is very close to the real thing, but that still doesn't make it the real thing. There may be other parts of the real thing that you just haven't noticed yet that are outside of your model, you see? So you always have to be open-minded that there's more to it. It's just a model. This isn't the real thing. This isn't the last answer. It's just what it is. It's a model in which to see yourself, reality, and everything that exists tied together. You know, between the Buddha and the quantum mechanics physicists, you know, it kind of ties all that together with one simple understanding, with two simple assumptions, and just take it for that. And it ought to mean something to each individual. The individual says, okay, fine, good. You figure all that. What does that mean to me? You know, well, what it means to you is that you have a purpose here. You're here for a reason. And if you meet that purpose and start to succeed in meeting that purpose, your life starts to become really, really good. You know, things work out for you. Things happen. The things you need fall in front of your feet just as you need them. You know, the world is good because now you're playing the game. Okay. But if you're stuck in a game and you don't know what the rules are and you're just wandering around on a playing field clueless, well, life isn't very good. You know, there's all these problems. And the people who work out of fear just create problems for themselves. They create unhappiness. They create dysfunction. Almost all of the problems that people face and deal with are self-created problems. It's their beliefs. It's their fear. And that's why it should mean something to you, you know, the individual, that it's not just some theory that the scientists can argue about and you really don't care. This is about individual and your life and how to make that life as productive and useful as you can. And if you do that, it's just amazing how your life gets so much more joyful than if you struggle to try to control things.
Mm-hmm. I think that is one of the reasons why it's so important for us to give this big overarching view of things and to kind of hit on all these different levels, because at least in my way of perceiving things, this allows a big field for people to kind of make connections with. There's a lot of surface area for people to connect to. And one person may connect at mark 15, minute 15. One person may connect at a random point in mark 20, in point 27 minutes, you know. And it's just going to be different for everyone. But one of the things that's really interesting to me is that when you get these revelations, or what you call when you get these things to become part of your being level, or get onto your being level, revelations or whatever aha moments, it feels like this big giant dial, and like this dial is like clicking and it's moving and then it clicks into a spot like you'd see on on a movie that has a big giant safe or something like this, right? Mm-hmm. And like these things click and it just feel like you get this feeling. It's like, oh, that's what's happening. You know, that's kind of what's going on. So I think that is what is so beautiful about what you're doing, Tom, and what your big toe represents, is it's this big giant overarching theory that allows for these revelations to happen pretty easily, I would say, because we're in such need of that left brain information, I think, and at least that's what it did for me. So I really appreciate that, Tom. One thing I would like to ask you, we ask all of our guests that come on at the end of our show, we ask them, we say, well, what are a couple of ways, what are your top 2 or 3 ways that we can reconnect with ourselves, reconnect with nature, reconnect with others? And I think another way of saying that is how do we lower entropy within ourselves?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of ways. The first, well, not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily have to go in any particular order. So it's saying a prescription, here's the first step, the second step, that's probably not true. That works for some of the people, but not all the people. So you get things in different orders. But it helps if you have a bigger picture, if you have the perspective of just how this reality system works, because then you can see who and what you are in it, and why am I here? What am I supposed to be doing? What's the point? Why is everything so difficult? You kind of understand that from a bigger viewpoint, and that's very, very helpful. But just some things. What should you do? And I guess before I go much further, I'd say there's a difference between understanding something at the intellectual level and understanding it at the being level. If all you do is understand this bigger picture at the intellectual level, it won't have done you much good. It'll make you a better conversationalist, but it won't really help you grow up much. If you understand it at a being level, that means that you've taken it on. It's not just in your head, but it's you. You have changed. And you now are a different person because now you take this understanding at a what I call the being level. So all growth, all changes in individuals have to take place at the being level. That's why I say this. So you can't go out and read a book. You can't go, watch all 200 of my videos and read my books 3 times and expect that now, life should be bliss and joy. It's not going to work that way unless you change at the being level. You have to change at the core of your being, not just what you think about. Okay, so one is much more primary than the other. So it's not an intellectual thing. So first of all, what do I do? Well, what you're going to do is going to have to change who you are and change what you are. It has to happen at your being level. Here's a little model that's very simple for people to see, and that is that the way this world works, the way we experience it is that stuff happens and then we get to deal with it. It's a simple model. Okay. And most of us spend almost all of our time focused on trying to make the stuff happen that we want to happen, trying to manipulate it up on the front end so that when the stuff happens, it's, that's what I want. They did this or they did that or I got this. You want to manipulate the front end so that you get it the way you want it. That's what we do. Okay. That's putting the emphasis on the wrong place. The way you grow up isn't by how clever you are at manipulating the world to be the way you want it. You grow up by the quality of your choices. Okay, it's the quality of your choice. Stuff happens. Now, what are you going to do about it? And even more important than what are you going to do about it is why are you going to do that about it? You see? So that's the real key. So instead of focusing all our attention and energy on how can we manipulate the stuff that happens to be what we want, let the stuff happen. Focus your energy. Now you still have to pay your mortgage and you still have to plan on how you're going to do that, right? And you still have to pick up your children at school when you're ready to be gotten. You still have responsibilities. I'm not saying forget about the rest of the world and don't have any responsibility. Responsibility is important, but put your emphasis on the choices that you make, not on the manipulation at the front end, but the choices you make at the back end. Stuff happens. How do you deal with it? Why do you deal with it? That is the key. If you can just make that change and focus there, that will make a big difference. For the most part, let as much of that front end go as you can. Yes, meet your responsibilities, do the things you need to do and you want to do, but let things happen as they happen. If you make good choices for the right reason, now that means choices based on love rather than choices based on fear. If you make choices for the right reason, you will find that all the stuff that's happening will start to straighten out and be just perfect. Everything that happens is a good thing and happens. You can deal with it and you can learn from it. That doesn't mean everything that happens will make you happy and dance. Sometimes hard things happen, but you will learn from it. You will grow from it. It will be a good thing for you. So that's one idea. Now, the point is that fear has a couple of things that it creates. Because if you have basic fear, that creates ego. It's about me. Well, what about me? Well, the reason you have the ego is because you're afraid that you won't get what you want or what you need if you don't make sure that it happens, if you don't manipulate that stuff, you see. So that's the ego. The other thing fear creates is belief. If you're fearful and you don't know something and you really need to know it, you feel better if you just make up something and believe it than if you have to deal with the uncertainty of not knowing it. So you need to live gracefully with uncertainty. Okay, let go of the belief, let go of the ego, let go of the fear, focus on the quality of your choice. Are you making choices based on other, or is it always about you? About you is the ego. So getting rid of the fear is your job. Outgrowing your fear is really your job here, because when you outgrow your fear, you become love. Take a person, get rid of all their fear, and what's left is love. You see, because if the person, by getting rid of the fear, means it's never about them, well, then it's about other. You see, that's love. So how do you do that from a practical stance? The first thing you should do is be very aware of what all your choices are. Every day you make hundreds of little choices, things to say, things to do, ways to feel. It's not only your doing, but it's your feeling too. It's what you are. Every day we make hundreds of choices. Okay, you can choose to be angry, or you could choose not to be angry. You could choose to be upset or not. So it's not just material choices like, do I pick up this rock or don't pick up the rock, but do I get upset? Does this bother me? Do I need to have my reality work in this way? In other words, do I have to manipulate? Why? Ask those questions. Why? Look at all the choices, the things you're doing. Why am I doing that? What's my motivation? What's my really gut level, being level motivation for that? For me doing that, for me being angry, for me being happy, whatever. And look at it. And if it happens to be about you, it's all about me getting what I want and I need, that's your ego, that's your fear. Let go of it. It won't be real easy to begin with. You just have to say, that's the wrong reason, the wrong motivation. That's the wrong intent for me here. I need to see what I can do to help, how I can be of service, how I can give to other, not how I can ensure that I'll get what I want from other. You see? So it's changing that attitude, becoming love, getting rid of fear, finding out your fears. That's easy. Find out your ego. When do you get upset? When do you feel negative? When do you feel anxious? All of that is ego. So if you ever feel upset, anxious, annoyed, any negative feeling, that's your ego. You can trace that back to a fear. Okay? Find that out and then try to let the fear go. The fear will usually be something silly. Most of those fears are paper tigers. You know, they're not really things that are going to get you. You're just afraid that they're going to get you. And once you have the courage to face them, they'll go poof like smoke and disappear. Most of the time, that's the way you'll find it. So that's what I would say. The first thing to do is look for your negative feelings, negative attitudes, negative thoughts, trace them back, see if you can find the ego, trace that back, see if you can find the fear, let the fear go. It's dysfunctional. It won't help you. And a lot of people will say, oh, I need that fear. That fear is what keeps me going. That fear is what causes you trouble. That fear is what makes your life awful, is that fear. You just so habituated to that fear that you're afraid of letting the fear go. That's another fear. You see, so you have to let all that stuff loose. When you do, you'll be surprised about how much fear you've got. You know, a lot of people that I talk to kind of have the idea that I don't really have any beliefs. I don't believe hardly anything at all. I don't take anything for granted and I don't have any fears. And then they find out after they've done this exercise a little while, about 3 or 4 months later, it's like, oh my God, I didn't know. Everything I do is based on fear. It's all about me. My relationships, at work, at home, children, spouse, everything. It's about me. It's all about fear. I'm living my life pushed and pulled by my fears. Well, once you realize that, that's good. Then you start working on them just one at a time. You're not going to grab them all and rip them out by the roots in one big pull. It doesn't work that way. Pick one and work on it. And you may work on it 6 months or a year before you get it gone. Then work on the next one. It's a long-term thing. We're not talking about, a fad, something you're going to do in a week. We're talking about a change in the way you approach life. And it will change your life. You will be a different person. People around you will notice that you're a different person and they will like you more and you will like you more and your life will just turn out to be so much more pleasant. And all the things that you feared that were going to bite you if you didn't, fight with them constantly won't bite you at all. They'll just melt away. Most of the fears are paper tigers. So that's what I'd say. Just try it. Try it for a couple of months. The second thing would be learn to meditate. Learn to meditate. And what meditation does, it just lets you get acquainted with your own consciousness. Now, many people, when they learn to meditate, they run into some of their fears. Well, that's okay. That's a good way for you to deal with them there. But just learn to meditate. You don't have to have any ulterior motives. You don't have to plan on remote viewing, going out of body, doing anything spectacular. Just meditate. Just learn to quiet your mind. Get your consciousness, though it's not always revved up, zinging around, like a wild cornered animal. Let all of that go. Settle your mind. That's a good thing to do. And it doesn't take long, but 20 minutes twice a day is all it takes. And you will notice if you do that in 3 or 4 months, you will change. That meditation will change you if you really are conscientious and you do it. And how do I meditate? Well, go look it up. There's 1,000 different ways to meditate, and you don't have to do any of them. You can just be still and be quiet and let your mind stop with its constant chatter. That's really what you do. Everything else is just a technique to help you achieve that. So you can learn to meditate. So those are 2 things. Look for the fears, look for the beliefs, always be open-minded, always be skeptical, learn to live gracefully with uncertainty, but you gotta do it. And you can't just do it in your intellect. You gotta have the courage to get up and say, I'm gonna do it, because it takes courage to face fears. Otherwise, the first time you see a fear, you'll be convinced that it's a good thing you have that fear, because that fear is what's saving you, and then you'll run away from it because you don't want to deal with it. You see, so you have to have the courage to say, I'm gonna get rid of these fears. And you will, if you do this, if you conscientiously do this for, let's say something easy like 3 months, you will notice that you are a different person. Mm-hmm. It makes a real difference. And if it doesn't, well, then forget it. Go do something else. Something else that makes you happy. Go, try it again in another couple of years. It's just give it a try like a scientist and say, well, I'll just see what happens. You don't have to believe anything. There's no theory. I want to try this getting rid of fear thing and just see what happens in 3 months. And it'll amaze you what will happen in 3 months.
Tom, thank you so much for coming on, man. It was a absolute blessing. Where can we find your work at, Tom? Where do we go?
Well, a couple of places. You can go to my website, which is www.mybigtoe.com, and there you can buy books or read about the books to get some idea of what they are. You can also buy books from Amazon or Baker and Taylor. You wouldn't know Baker and Taylor serves libraries. You can go to any bookstore. Baker and Taylor serves bookstores too, and if they don't have it on the shelf, they can order it. Through Baker and Taylor, which is a big wholesaler of books. You can get it at Barnes and Noble. You can find it free on Google Books, so you can go there and read it off your monitor if you want. Then you can also go to a website called MBT Events, www.mbtevents.com. And there you will find out my schedule, where I'm going. My next thing I'm going to be at is in May 17th at Spokane, Washington. So you can find out what's going on there and how to sign up or how to find out about it and get directions and all that stuff. You can get it at MBT Events. And then if you'd like to take a look at the other things I've done, the other talks I've given, interviews I've had, workshops I've completed, and so on, most of them are on my YouTube channel. And you can go to YouTube, and you can probably just go to YouTube and put in Thomas Campbell or My Big Toe and get there. But if not, my ID is TWCJR44. TWCJR44. So that would be www.youtube.com/TWCJR44. And that will take you to my channel. I got over 200 videos there. And this one that I'm going to do in Spokane, it'll be there if we can get it. Sometimes technology frustrates you and you don't get good video or good audio or something. So I don't have everything I've done there, but everything I have that I have successfully captured is up there. So, and this little, audio we're making right now, I hope will be up there on my, YouTube channel one day. People will be able to go up there and read it. So that's how you get to my, to my stuff, but it's easy if you just go to Google and put in Thomas Campbell, or you just go into Google and put in My Big Toe, you will get lots of pointers to get to all these other places.
Tom, we love you, brother. Thank you so much, man.
Thank you, Justin. It's been fun, but it lasted a little bit more than an hour, didn't it?
A little bit, yeah, man.
I told you that was gonna happen. An hour just doesn't get you very far. So now we're going on what?
About little over 2.
Yeah, a little over 2 hours, and we've done a lot.
We've done a lot, man. We've covered a lot, and I really appreciate it. Stick on the line for a minute, Tom, and we'll talk a little bit more.
Okay.